They say one decision can change your life forever. Not in some dramatic, earth-shattering way. Sometimes it's quiet, subtle, a slow unraveling that you don't even realize is happening until it's too late. I never believed that until that night. I used to think I knew myself, knew where my limits were, what lines I would never cross. But life has a strange way of testing you, pushing you into corners you never thought you'd find yourself in. And the scariest part? Sometimes you don't even see it coming. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious. Just a conversation. Just a moment. Just a request. I didn't expect my younger brother to ask me that. I didn't expect to say yes. And I definitely didn't expect what happened after. But if I'm being honest, the scariest part wasn't what happened. It was how much I wanted it to. And that's what I can't admit out loud. If you've ever found yourself standing at the edge of a decision you swore you'd never make, you're not alone. Subscribe now, because the truth is, real life is far more complicated than we like to admit. I should start at the beginning. Because no story like this happens overnight. It's not some sudden impulse, some reckless mistake made in a fleeting moment of weakness. No, these things, they build. They grow in the silences, in the unspoken words, in the small, almost unnoticeable shifts that, one day, become impossible to ignore. My name? That doesn't really matter. What matters is that I am, a wife. A mother. Someone who, from the outside looking in, had everything. A beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood. A husband who provided, who was responsible, who did everything he was supposed to do. And yet, if you were to step inside my life, past the carefully curated pictures on the walls, past the laughter at dinner parties, past the perfectly scripted conversations between my husband and me, you'd feel it. That hollowness. That empty space between us that kept growing, stretching, until we were two strangers living under the same roof. We weren't always like this. Once, a long time ago, I think we loved each other. Or at least, we tried. But time has a way of stealing things: intimacy, effort, connection. Somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing each other. Stopped touching. Stopped talking about anything that actually mattered. Now, he's always busy. Work calls. Late meetings. Business trips that seem to last longer each time. When he is home, he's there, but not really there. Sitting in his study, drowning in emails, barely lifting his head when I walk past. And me? I stopped trying. Stopped asking him to notice me. Stopped fighting for something that didn't want to be saved. That's the kind of loneliness that doesn't make sense to people. Because I wasn't alone, I had a husband, a house, a life. But I may as well have been invisible. Then, there was him. My younger brother. He wasn't supposed to be here, not permanently anyway. Just a temporary stay, a few months while he got his life together. My husband's mother's son from a previous marriage, technically family, but not in the way that matters. He was younger than me, but not by much. Late teens or early 20s, but with a presence that made him seem older. The kind of presence that filled a room without trying. Charismatic. Playful. The kind of guy who could make a joke out of anything, who had this easy confidence, like the world had never been cruel to him. And maybe it hadn't. Or maybe he had just learned how to laugh through it. But there was something else. Something underneath the smirks and the teasing. A weight he carried. A sadness that slipped through the cracks when he thought no one was looking. I noticed it because I knew that feeling well. He moved in during one of the worst seasons of my marriage, when my husband had completely checked out, when I had stopped pretending to care. At first, he was just another presence in the house, another person walking through rooms I barely lived in anymore. But then, something shifted. Maybe it was the way he talked to me, actually talked to me. Not out of obligation, not distractedly, but fully. Like I was someone worth listening to. Maybe it was the way he saw me, really saw me. Not as a wife, not as someone's mother, but as a woman. A person. Or maybe it was just that. For the first time in a long time, I felt awake again. At first, it was nothing. Just conversations over coffee in the mornings. Small jokes thrown back and forth across the kitchen. Casual, meaningless things. But loneliness is a dangerous thing. Because when you're starving, even the smallest crumbs can taste like a feast. Our house was beautiful, one of those homes you see in lifestyle magazines. Modern, elegant, everything perfectly in place. But no one tells you that a house can be both full and empty at the same time. The kitchen, always spotless, always ready for a meal that never really felt shared. The living room, with a couch that had more memories of silence than laughter. The bedroom, cold on one side, barely touched, a space that used to belong to something resembling love. And now, this house had him. He changed the air inside these walls. Where there was once only silence, now there was laughter. Lightness. A new energy that hadn't existed before. I told myself it was harmless. That it was just nice to have someone to talk to. That I was just happy to feel seen. But the truth? The truth was that I had already started crossing lines in my mind before I ever crossed them in reality. And that was the first mistake. It was a night like any other. Or at least, that's what I told myself. My husband was home, but in the way he always was. Present, yet absent. Shut inside his study, the glow of his computer screen flickering through the gap beneath the door. His voice, when I had last heard it, had been clipped, distracted. Another late-night project. Another excuse. I had stopped asking when he'd be done. Stopped waiting up for him. Instead, I was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over my legs, half watching some forgettable show on the TV. The kind of thing you put on for background noise just to feel less alone. And then, he walked in. My step-younger brother. He wasn't supposed to be here tonight. He usually went out, had his own life, his own people. But tonight, for whatever reason, he stayed. He leaned against the doorway at first, watching me with that easy, lopsided smile of his. "You look miserable," he said, teasing, but with a softness that told me he wasn't just joking. I huffed out a laugh, shaking my head. "Thanks for that." "No, really," he said, stepping further inside. "Why do you always sit here alone?" The way he asked it, so casual, so direct, made something tighten in my chest. I could have brushed it off. Could have made a joke, told him I liked my alone time. But instead, the truth slipped out before I could stop it. Because I don't have anyone else to sit with. The words hung between us, heavier than I meant them to be. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Just looked at me. Then, with a small shake of his head, he sighed. "That's sad." I let out a breathless laugh, rolling my eyes. "Yeah, well, welcome to marriage. Does it have to be like that?" The question was quiet, thoughtful, and it caught me off guard. I blinked at him, my fingers tightening around the blanket in my lap. I didn't know how to answer that. Because the truth? I wasn't sure anymore. I used to believe that love was something that only faded if you let it. That passion, connection, those things could be nurtured, protected. But now I wasn't so sure. Maybe, I said finally. Maybe some things just run their course. I expected him to let it go, to change the subject. Instead, he walked over, flopped onto the couch beside me, and grabbed the remote from my hand. "Okay," he said, flipping through channels. "Then let's not be sad tonight." I raised a brow. "What exactly do you have in mind?" He smirked, glancing sideways at me. "Something better than this garbage you're watching." I laughed despite myself, shaking my head. And just like that, the tension was gone. Or at least, it should have been. We ended up talking. Not about anything important at first, just easy, meaningless things. The kind of late-night conversations that make the world feel smaller, more intimate. He told me about his life, his frustrations, the things he wanted but couldn't quite reach. I told him about mine, well, the parts one was willing to share. At some point, he got up and grabbed a bottle of wine from the kitchen. "Come on," he said, pouring us each a glass. "Let's be reckless. Stay up late. Be young again." I rolled my eyes but took the glass anyway. We drank. We laughed. The walls between us, whatever unspoken boundaries had been there before, started to soften. And then, he asked, "Let's go for a drive." I blinked. "Right now? Why not?" He grinned, tilting his head. "You need it. Trust me." I hesitated. It wasn't anything inappropriate. It wasn't a proposition. It was just a drive. But there was something about the way he looked at me. Like he was daring me. Like he knew I would say yes before I even knew it myself. And maybe that's what scared me. Because I did say yes. The night air was cool when we stepped outside. The world felt different at this hour, quieter, softer, like it belonged to us and no one else. He drove. I sat in the passenger seat, my window cracked open, letting the breeze roll in. The city lights blurred past, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Where are we going? I asked after a while. Nowhere, he said. That's the point. And for some reason, I liked that answer. We drove in comfortable silence for a while, the radio playing something soft, something that felt like nostalgia. And then, he spoke again. You know, you're different when he's not around. I turned my head toward him, frowning slightly. What do you mean? He glanced at me briefly before looking back at the road. You laugh more. You actually smile. You seem, I don't know, alive. I swallowed. Looked down at my hands. You notice that? I asked softly. Of course I notice. There was something about the way he said it. Something that sent a small shiver down my spine. I turned to look out the window, my heart beating just a little faster than before. And that was the moment. The shift. Because it wasn't just a drive anymore. It was something else. Something unspoken. A line we hadn't crossed, but we had both stepped toward it. And even though nothing had happened yet, I already knew. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. I should have felt nothing. That's what I told myself as we drove in silence, the weight of his words still hanging in the air. You're different when he's not around. The way he said it, it wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a question. It was just an observation. One I hadn't expected, one I hadn't been ready to hear. Because it was true. I was different when my husband wasn't around. I was lighter, more myself. Or maybe just more of the self I used to be before I became just a wife. Just a duty. Just a presence in the background of someone else's life. And the worst part? I liked the way he noticed. I shifted in my seat, forcing a small laugh, as if I could shake the moment off, as if I could push away the strange, unspoken energy that had settled between us. I think you're imagining things, I said, forcing a lightness into my voice. He didn't argue. He just gave me this knowing little smile, the kind that made my stomach tighten for reasons I refused to acknowledge. Maybe, he said, turning back to the road. Or maybe you just don't want to admit it. I swallowed, looking away. It was just a drive. Just a conversation. That's what I told myself as we pulled back into the driveway later that night, as we sat in the car for a beat too long, neither of us moving to get out. Thanks for coming with me, he said softly, his hands still resting on the steering wheel. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. It was just a drive. Just a conversation. Just comfort. That's what I repeated to myself as I stepped into the house, my heart pounding in a way it shouldn't have been. And yet, as I passed by my husband's study, the door still closed, the light still on, I felt something sink deep inside me. A realization. A quiet, terrifying truth. I wanted him to notice that I had been gone. I wanted him to care. But he didn't. He never did. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of my husband's breathing beside me. He hadn't asked where I had been. Hadn't looked up from his screen when I walked past. Hadn't even noticed the shift in me, the way my body hummed with an energy I hadn't felt in years, the way my thoughts were tangled in someone that wasn't him. I told myself it wasn't wrong. Nothing happened. Nothing was going to happen. It was just a moment. But if it was just a moment, why did it feel so significant? Why did my skin still tingle where his gaze had lingered? Why did I still hear his voice in my head, soft and knowing? You laugh more when he's not around. The days that followed were slow torture. Because now I was aware. Aware of the way he moved around the house, how easily he fit into my space, how effortlessly he made me feel seen in ways I had almost forgotten were possible. Aware of the way my stomach flipped when he entered the room, of the way I suddenly felt the need to check my reflection in passing mirrors, of the way his presence felt like an unspoken secret only I understood. And worst of all, I was aware that he knew it too. I told myself I was imagining things, that he didn't look at me the way I thought he did, that the moments I felt between us weren't really there, that I wasn't waiting for him to linger in the kitchen after dinner, to sit beside me on the couch, to brush past me in the hallway just a little too closely, that my pulse didn't race every time he spoke my name, that I wasn't standing at the edge of something dangerous, something that I should turn away from before it was too late. But the truth? The truth was that I didn't want to turn away. And that was what scared me the most. Because if I had already started craving something that hadn't even happened, then maybe, deep down, I had already made my choice. I should have been more careful. I should have seen the warning signs, the small, seemingly innocent moments that, one by one, started stacking on top of each other, building into something neither of us could ignore. But the truth? I didn't want to be careful. I didn't want to stop. And that was how it started. It began with the late nights. At first, it was unintentional. We'd both be in the kitchen, passing each other as I made tea, as he grabbed a drink from the fridge. "You're up late," he'd say. "So are you," I'd reply. And just like that, we'd slip into conversation. At first, it was light, casual, the kind of small talk that didn't mean anything. But then it became more. Deeper. Personal. He told me things I knew he didn't tell other people, his fears, his regrets, the things he wanted but didn't know how to reach. And I told him things I hadn't even admitted to myself. "Do you ever feel like you're just existing?" I asked one night, my fingers tracing the rim of my mug. He exhaled softly, tilting his head. "All the time." His answer sent something sharp through me, an understanding so intimate it felt like he had reached inside me and pulled out something I had buried long ago. We sat there, in that quiet, heavy silence, our truths hanging between us. It should have ended there. But it didn't. It was small, so small it should have meant nothing. A brush of his fingers against my wrist as he reached for something on the counter. A touch so fleeting, so unintentional, that I should have ignored it. But I didn't. Because I felt it. Felt the heat of it, the awareness that sparked up my arm, the way my breath hitched just slightly, too subtly for him to notice. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But then it kept happening. A hand on my back as he moved past me. A touch on my arm that lingered a second too long. A hug that wasn't really a hug, just an excuse to be close. Tiny moments. Meaningless if I wanted them to be. Except they weren't. Because each time, I felt it more. Each time, I wanted it more. The house was quiet, my husband asleep upstairs, unaware, as always, of the world happening beyond his closed door. I had been sitting on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone when he walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside me, so close our legs almost touched. I should have moved. But I didn't. "You always look lost in thought," he said after a moment. I glanced at him, my pulse betraying me. Maybe I just have a lot on my mind. He studied me, his eyes darker than usual, something unreadable flickering behind them. "You can talk to me, you know." I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "I know." The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. And then, he reached out. Just barely. Just enough. His fingers brushed against my knee, a touch so light, so hesitant, that it could have been an accident. But it wasn't. Because neither of us moved away. Because in that moment, with the weight of the house pressing down on us, with the world outside feeling too distant to be real, it felt like something was pulling us together, something bigger than either of us. Something inevitable. His eyes dropped to my lips. For the briefest second, I thought he was going to kiss me. For the briefest second, I wanted him to. But then I heard it. A sound. A shift upstairs. My husband turning in bed. The reality of it snapped through me like ice water, sharp and unforgiving. I jerked away, my breath shaky, my heart slamming against my ribs. "I should go to bed," I whispered, my voice unsteady. He didn't stop me. He didn't say a word. He just watched me, his expression unreadable, as I stood and walked away. And as I climbed the stairs, my hands trembling, my body still buzzing with the ghost of what almost happened. I knew. I knew it should have stopped there. It really should have. But it wouldn't. Because I had already ignored too many warning signs. And now? Now, I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. I don't know if I ever really believed in fate. I used to think life was just a series of choices. You wake up, you do what's expected of you, you play your part. Nothing just happens, you allow it. You choose it. But that night, it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like something that had been waiting for me. For us. Like no matter how many times I told myself we had gone too far, that we needed to stop, that we would stop, this was always going to happen. My husband was gone that weekend. A business trip, or a conference, something important enough that he barely even told me he was leaving, just left his itinerary on the counter, a quick peck on the cheek before disappearing out the door. No, I'll miss you. No, can't wait to come home. Just absence. By then, I was used to it. By then, I had stopped waiting for him to notice I was missing too. It had been 2 days of an empty house. 2 days of passing by his empty study, knowing he wouldn't be walking through that door, wouldn't be sitting at that desk, too lost in his work to acknowledge me. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew, this weekend, something was going to happen. Maybe I had known the moment my husband told me he was leaving. Maybe I had known the moment I saw my younger brother standing in the kitchen that morning, coffee mug in hand, bare feet against the tile, looking at me like he knew I wasn't going to spend this weekend alone. Maybe I had known long before that. It happened late. Too late for excuses. Too late to pretend it was just another casual night. The rain had started sometime in the evening, soft at first, then heavier, filling the house with a steady rhythm, like a warning. We had been sitting in the living room, the glow of the television the only source of light. I don't even remember what was playing. I hadn't been watching it. I had been watching him. And he had been watching me. The air between us had been shifting for weeks, and we both knew it. Every glance that lingered too long. Every touch that meant nothing, except it did. And now? Now, we were past the point of pretending. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice low, unreadable. "So are you," I murmured, fingers curling against the blanket draped over my lap. A pause. Then, softly, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" I should have said no. I should have said no. Instead, I turned to face him. We were close. Closer than we had ever been before. The flickering light of the television cast shadows over his face, highlighting the way his jaw clenched, the way his eyes darkened. I felt it. The moment right before everything changed. The moment where I could still walk away. But I didn't. Because when he reached for me, when his hand found my cheek, his thumb brushing against my skin, slow, hesitant, asking rather than taking, I leaned in. And just like that, the line was gone. The space between us collapsed. And I let it happen. His lips were warm. His hands, unsure at first, then certain. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't frantic. It was slow, deliberate. Like we both knew exactly what we were doing, what we had been doing for a long, long time. I should have felt guilty. I should have thought about my husband, about my marriage, about every promise I was shattering in that moment. But all I could think about was the way he was touching me. The way his breath felt against my neck. The way my body had been starved for this kind of attention for years. It wasn't just physical. It was everything. The way he listened. The way he looked at me like I mattered. The way he made me feel alive. And in that moment, drowning in the feeling of him, his hands, his mouth, the weight of him pressing against me, I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care about what came next. I just wanted more. It wasn't until much later, when the room was silent again, when the storm outside had quieted to a gentle drizzle, that it hit me. What I had done. What we had done. I sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around me, my breath still unsteady, my heart still racing. Beside me, he was quiet, watching me, waiting. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. And that was what made my stomach twist the most. Because my husband hadn't asked me that in years. I swallowed, nodding, but I wasn't sure if it was true. Because the weight of it was starting to settle. The weight of him. Of us. Of the fact that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And even as I sat there, wrapped in guilt, in confusion, in the terrifying realization of what had just happened, there was a darker, quieter part of me whispering in the back of my mind. A part of me I didn't want to acknowledge. A part of me that wasn't sorry. I woke up before he did. The moment my eyes opened, reality slammed into me like a fist to the chest. My pulse stuttered. My breath caught. For a second, I couldn't move. I could still feel him, his warmth lingering beside me, his scent mixed with mine, the weight of what we had done pressing down on me like a secret too big to hold. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake him. My hands were trembling as I reached for the blanket, pulling it around my body like a shield, as if that could undo the night before. As if that could erase the way his hands had touched me, the way I had let him touch me. I told myself to breathe. Just breathe. But how could I, when the air in the room felt suffocating? I needed to get out. By the time he woke up, I was already in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a coffee mug, my fingers gripping the ceramic too tightly. I heard him before I saw him, the soft creak of the floorboards, the hesitant way he stepped into the room. Neither of us spoke at first. We didn't look at each other. We didn't know how to. And that silence? That silence was louder than anything. "Hey," he finally said, his voice rough with sleep, careful, measured. "Hey," I echoed, staring down at the swirling liquid in my mug. The tension was unbearable. Last night had felt inevitable. But now? Now it felt impossible. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer this time. I forced myself to nod. "Yeah, fine." I wasn't. We weren't. And we both knew it. The sound of keys jangling near the front door sent a sharp spike of panic through my chest. My husband. I had forgotten what it felt like to fear being caught, forgotten that I wasn't just some woman wrapped up in the thrill of stolen moments. I was a wife. And I had just betrayed my husband in the worst way possible. I barely had time to react before the door opened, and there he was, my husband, stepping inside, shaking off the dampness of the morning rain. "Morning," he said, setting his bag down, already distracted, already slipping back into his world where I was nothing more than background noise. "Morning," I replied, my voice carefully steady. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my stepbrother tense. His jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. For the first time, I saw it, the weight of what we had done sinking into him, too. My husband glanced between us briefly, his brow furrowing. "You're up early," he noted, more to me than to him. I forced a casual shrug. Just couldn't sleep. It wasn't a lie. But it also wasn't the truth. And the way my stepbrother exhaled, shifting awkwardly on his feet, told me he felt it too. A shift. A crack. A danger we weren't prepared for. I thought I could pretend like nothing had happened. I thought I could slip back into my life, play my part, bury it deep enough that it would disappear. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves. Even in the smallest ways. A stolen glance that lasted a second too long. A touch that lingered, even when it shouldn't. A breath held in silence, waiting for the weight of the truth to crash down. I told myself I was imagining it. That my husband wasn't looking at me differently. That he wasn't sensing something had shifted. But suspicion isn't loud. It's quiet. It seeps in slowly, through the cracks, through the unspoken things. And once it's there, it doesn't leave. That night, my husband was different. He watched me. Not in the way I had always wanted him to, not with love, not with longing, not with desire. But with something else. Something unsettling. I could feel his eyes on me at dinner. Could hear the unspoken questions in the pauses between his words. "How was your weekend?" he asked, too casually. "Fine," I answered too quickly. "You and him spend a lot of time together?" I nearly dropped my fork. "What?" He shrugged, taking a sip of his drink. "Just saying. You two seem close." The words sent a chill down my spine. Was he just making conversation? Or was this something else? Did he know? I forced a smile, reaching for my own glass, trying to keep my hands steady. "We're family," I said simply. He hummed, nodding. But the way his gaze lingered, the way he let the silence stretch just a little too long before he looked away, I knew. I knew. He was starting to suspect. And once suspicion starts, it never really goes away. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, his back turned to me, his breathing slow and even, I felt trapped. By guilt. By fear. By the knowledge that I had already started something I couldn't control. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but all I could see was him. My step-younger brother. The way he had looked at me this morning, like he wanted to reach for me, but knew he couldn't anymore. The way his hands had felt last night, certain, hungry, like he had been waiting for me for a long, long time. The way I had let him. And the worst part? Even as guilt clawed at my throat, even as fear wrapped around my ribs, even as I lay next to the man I had vowed to be faithful to. I didn't regret it. Not yet. But I would. Because this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And I was about to lose everything. What have I done? The question repeated itself in my head like a broken record, looping over and over again, filling every quiet moment, seeping into every thought. At first, I told myself it was just a mistake, a lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness. But then another voice whispered back. Was it? Because the truth, the part one couldn't ignore, no matter how much I wanted to, was that I hadn't stopped it. I hadn't wanted to stop it, and that was the part one couldn't run from. Guilt is a strange thing. It doesn't hit all at once. It comes in waves, in whispers, in flashes of memory that make your stomach turn and your hands tremble. I felt it when I saw my husband in the morning, sipping his coffee, scrolling through emails like nothing had changed, because for him, nothing had changed. I felt it when I passed by a mirror and caught my own reflection, searching my own face for the woman I used to be. But then there was something else. Something darker. Something worse. Because for every moment of guilt, there was another feeling buried underneath. A quiet, persistent ache. A craving. A memory of his hands, his mouth, his breath against my skin. A need. And that was the part that made me hate myself the most. Because how could I regret something that still made my heart race just thinking about it? I spent the next few days in a haze, moving through life on autopilot, pretending everything was fine, pretending I was fine. But inside, I was unraveling. I told myself it could never happen again. I told myself I would stay away from him. I told myself it was over. But words mean nothing when your body betrays you. Because every time I heard his footsteps down the hall, my pulse quickened. Every time I felt his eyes on me, heat curled low in my stomach. Every time we passed each other in the kitchen, in the hallway, in the quiet corners of the house where no one was looking, there was a moment. A breath held too long. A glance that lingered too much. A tension so thick it felt like something tangible, something pressing against my skin, something waiting for me to break. I knew what I had to do. But the question was, could I do it? For the briefest of moments, I considered telling my husband. I don't know why. Maybe I thought confessing would make the guilt easier to carry. Maybe I thought if I told him, it would force me to stop before it got worse. Maybe I just wanted to see if he would even care. One night, as we lay in bed, the silence stretching between us like an unspoken truth, I opened my mouth. There's something I need to tell you. The words were right there. On the tip of my tongue. He didn't even turn to look at me. He hummed absently, his eyes still on his phone. And in that moment, I knew. It wouldn't matter. He wouldn't fight for me. He wouldn't beg for the truth. He wouldn't care. So I swallowed the words. Buried them deep. And just like that, I made my choice. I wouldn't tell him. Because what was the point? Because deep down, I knew he had already lost me. And maybe I had already lost myself, too. I tried to stay away from my stepbrother. Really, I did. But the thing about crossing a line is that once you do, you can't go back to pretending it doesn't exist. The space between us had changed. It was no longer safe. I felt it in the way he looked at me, like he was waiting for me to acknowledge what we had done, what we were now. I felt it in the way my breath hitched when he entered a room, in the way my body instinctively moved closer, drawn to him like gravity. And the worst part? I felt it in the way he started keeping his distance too. Not because he wanted to, but because he knew if he got too close, we would fall back into something neither of us were strong enough to stop. But that distance? That silence? It didn't fix anything. If anything, it made it worse. Because the more we tried to avoid each other, the more we felt the absence. The more we realized that staying away didn't erase what had happened. It only made us want it more. One evening, as I was cleaning up the kitchen, I felt it. A shift. A presence. I turned, and my husband was standing in the doorway, watching me. Not in the way he normally did. Not with the distracted, absent-minded glance of someone who had long since stopped seeing me. No, this was different. His eyes were sharp. His posture tense. Like he was looking for something. Like he was waiting for me to slip. A chill crept down my spine. "What?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. And then, so casually it made my stomach drop, he said, "You've been acting strange lately." I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "I don't know what you're talking about." But I could see it in his eyes. He knew something was off. Maybe he didn't know what exactly. Maybe he didn't have proof. But suspicion doesn't need proof. It just needs time. And time? Time was running out. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to end up here. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed, to make a choice that couldn't be undone. But here I am. And now, I don't know what comes next. I don't know if I can keep pretending like nothing happened. If I can keep looking my husband in the eye, knowing what I've done, knowing what I want to do again. I don't know if I can keep staying away from him, my step-younger brother. Knowing that no matter how much space I try to put between us, the pull will always be there. The craving, the hunger. I don't know if I should confess. Or if I should take this secret to my grave. So I need to know, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you tell the truth, knowing it could destroy everything? Or would you keep it buried, knowing that secrets don't just stay hidden forever? Let me know in the comments. I need to know I'm not alone in this. And if you want more stories like this, stories about the choices we make, the consequences we face, and the lines we cross without even realizing it, subscribe now. Because the truth is, real life is messier than fiction. And sometimes, the biggest secrets? They're the ones we keep even from ourselves. I used to think I knew myself. I used to think I knew the difference between right and wrong, between control and surrender, between loyalty and betrayal. I used to believe there were lines I would never cross. But the thing about lines? Sometimes they don't break all at once. Sometimes they blur, soft, subtle, almost unnoticeable, until one day you look down and realize you're already standing on the other side. And by then, it's too late. I told myself I had control. That what happened was a mistake. A moment of weakness. A lapse in judgment. But if that were true, why did it feel like something deeper? Something inevitable? Because when I look back, I don't just see the moment it happened. I see all the moments before, the ones that led me here. The glances, the touches, the conversations that lingered just a little too long. I see the warning signs I ignored. The choices I told myself weren't really choices at all. And the truth? I don't think I ever had control. Not really. Every secret has a cost. Some are paid in guilt. Some in regret. And some in consequences that haven't revealed themselves yet. I can feel it. The tension. The weight of what I've done pressing against me, curling around my ribs like a vice. I can feel my husband's eyes on me more than before, watching, searching, sensing that something has changed, even if he can't name it yet. I can feel the way my step-younger brother and I move around each other now, careful, hesitant, but still tethered by something neither of us are willing to name. I can feel the silence growing louder, whispering a question I'm too afraid to answer. How long until the truth comes out? Because the thing about secrets? They don't just stay buried. They grow. They spread. They wait, patient, silent, until the moment they decide to reveal themselves. And by then, the damage is already done. I wish I could say this is where it ends. That I made the right choice. That I walked away, confessed, or found some way to fix what I had broken. But that would be a lie. Because the truth is, I still don't know what comes next. I still don't know if this is over. If it ever really was. And the worst part? The part that keeps me up at night, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding with something I can't quite name? I still don't know if I regret it. Drop a comment. What do you think? Should secrets like this stay buried or come to light? Subscribe for more stories that explore the messy, complicated truth of human relationships. And remember, some lines don't break all at once. They fade. And by the time you notice, you're already on the other side.